Not only is Bitcoin reaching all-time highs, but altcoins are not far behind. Do these trends suggest correlations between blockchains, and how will blockchain bridges shift governance structures? Welcome to Word on the Block, the series that takes a deeper dive into blockchain and the emerging technologies that shape our world at the intersection of business, politics, and economy. It's what we cover right here on Forkast.News. I'm Forkast Editor-in-Chief Angie Lau. Well, we see Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, they're now the top three cryptocurrencies by market cap when we disregard stablecoins like USDT, of course, but Bitcoin really leading the way. Right now, it reached a new all-time high of 40,000, but when you watch this, who knows where the price is going to be. But certainly altcoins and the interest in this space is following suit. Investors and analysts are suggesting a possible correlation between Bitcoin and altcoin prices in bullish phases. And could this suggest a growing need for interoperability? Well, in efforts to expand its ecosystems, Cardano and Litecoin are taking the lead towards the next generation of interoperable blockchains. And our next guest today is, of course, the one and only CEO and founder of IOHK, co-founder of Ethereum and Cardano, and professional YouTuber from warm, sunny Colorado, Charles Hoskinson. Charles, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Angie. Thank you so much for having me on. How's Hong Kong?
It's, things, I think, how's the world is we're all hanging in there. I think everybody who's watching and who we've been speaking to, just, we're hanging in. But I think for all of us in this space, we are a distributed and decentralized bunch. So what we've seen in terms of growth in 2020 is certainly what has also driven growth where you are. Tell us more what's happening behind the scenes at Cardano.
Well, yeah, last year was probably our busiest year. We went from the Byron era to the Shelley era to the first part of the Gauguin era, all in 1 year. Probably, I don't know, 500,000 lines of code, and we wrote a lot of papers. We increased the size of the network overall by a factor of 7. So there's 7 times as many people at the end of 2020 as there were in the beginning of 2020. It was a great year in markets, great year in development, great year in adoption. It was tough, but definitely worthwhile. Shelley was definitely the biggest milestone because that's where we went from a static and federated system to a dynamic and decentralized system. And we have now 1,200 plus stake pool operators who are in the network, running the network, and rapidly decentralizing. So it's very humbling in that respect. And now we're starting to talk about smart contracts. We're starting to talk about a lot more use and utility above and beyond just metadata and a store of value and a unit of account. So this is the age of dApps and the age of DeFi, and it's going to be really exciting to see Cardano explore that and fight for that. Last year we also began governance. So we launched the Voltaire era, and we went from just some ideas on a whiteboard to over 5,000 people participating in funding rounds every 6 to 8 weeks, where the community was voting on proposals to give grants to ideas, everything ranging from starting your own podcast to building a business. So it's really exciting to see decentralized fundraising also working in the right ways, and to see so much participation and work with great partners like IdeaScale and others who have been able to really facilitate high quality proposals and high quality dialogue between people. So all things considered, I think it's probably the most productive year we've ever had. And I look forward to 2021. If we can keep this momentum and extend it, we're really going to give Ethereum and the rest of these guys a run for their money.
I think there is no doubt the momentum is just going to grow from an incredible foundation called 2020. And this industry being such a grassroots industry and supported by the people who are actually building, investing energy into protocols, as you've said. But, on the top end, and what's fueling a lot of that momentum are the institutionals, the dollars from the top end that are now feeling warmer in the waters, putting more than just their feet in the water here. And so for those who, are only familiar with potentially Bitcoin or Ethereum as a smart contract in terms of enterprise, what is the difference that Shelley and Cardano hope to achieve for enterprise and for traditional legacy structures?
So when you use a blockchain, whatever the business utility could be, and it could be a decentralized property registration system, it could be an e-voting system, it could be a supply chain system. So the concept of a smart contract is saying, okay, you have actors and events between those actors, transactions between them. So for example, with a supply chain, you have numerous nodes that whatever you're moving, it could be beef, it could be clothing, touch, so actors that it touches, and there's state transitions between them. So for example, if I'm growing coffee, one state is taking the coffee off the tree, another is putting it on the back of the donkey and taking it to the washing station, another can be taking it to the roasters, another can be taking it to the exchange for export. And every step of the way, there's some logic behind that, and there's some tests and thresholds and so forth. Well, that's kind of the idea of a smart contract. And what's exciting about cryptocurrencies is that you can do this without relying upon trusted central authorities. And that's great in a world where we don't trust each other so much anymore, a world where we have to globalize, and a world where institutions are rapidly decaying in credibility, as we saw yesterday with the storming of the US Capitol. Things aren't working as well as they used to. So systems like Ethereum, what they do is they give you a collection of tools to basically write up all that logic and get that logic running in a trustless way amongst many counterparties. The problem with these second generation systems is kind of threefold. One, they don't scale so well. So it's very difficult to go from dozens to hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of users in a cost-effective way. In fact, right now, Ethereum is one of the most expensive systems in the world to operate for any reasonable business logic. Two, these systems tend not to be very interoperable, especially with legacy systems. The reality is commerce and human trade, it requires you to talk to many different standards across the world, some government controlled, some through corporations, some through open standards and so forth. So you really need interoperability for these systems to work correctly. And then finally, there's an issue of sustainability. And this is really the who pays and who decides. So when you have an open protocol, and you no longer have a custodial entity, things get a little difficult. When we look at Android, we tend to think of Google. When we look at Windows, we tend to think of Microsoft, or the iPhone, we think of Apple products. Well, the issue is what happens when you remove Apple, Microsoft, and Google? Who's going to maintain those systems? And so there's this issue of who maintains Cardano, or who maintains Ethereum, and who maintains Bitcoin. So we decided it's such a significant problem that you really do need to make special provisions for it. The other thing is change management. And so what happens when you want to upgrade the system? The bigger the system gets, the more people who use the system, you tend to have a slowdown in innovation. So for Bitcoin, for example, it's been around for 12 years. It's a victim of its own success. It's very effective for what it does. But when they say, hey, let's get smart contracts in Bitcoin, or hey, let's upgrade the system so it has more transaction throughput or cheaper transactions, it's damn near impossible to upgrade the system. And so what you need is a governance layer that allows you to pay for the upgrades you want to do and finance the people who are going to change the system, evolve and grow the system, but then also be able to vote on how changes occur. And if you have all three of these properties, we term this a third generation cryptocurrency. So right now we have a big renaissance in our industry. We have projects like Algorand and Tezos and Cardano, and each and every one of them has a blend of protocols and opinions about how to achieve scale and interoperability and ultimately have a sustainable system. So you kind of keep all the good in the past. So you keep the smart contracts and you keep all the things that Ethereum brought to market, but you're just doing it at a scale instead of thousands or tens of thousands, millions to billions. And then you also keep the things that Bitcoin brought to bear. So that trustlessness, that decentralization, that reliable, immutable database and timestamping and so forth. So it took about 10 years to get to the third generation. And now that we're here, it's really exciting to be competing in. Every platform, we try to offer our own unique blend. Cardano, what we chose to do was start from first principles. So what we did was we wrote more than 90 academic papers, and a lot of them have gone through the peer review process at major conferences like Eurocrypt and Crypto and CCS. And we established the scientific foundations of our project. So basically we said, okay, what's fact, what's fiction, what can we actually do versus what we'd like to do, and where will the science take us? And then based on that, we built a big corpus of knowledge that we leveraged with good engineering to build a high assurance system that not only works well with a good foundation, but we think is a good platform for the future. It's kind of like with vaccine research. They spent about 20 years doing hardcore research into mRNA. And now that they've done that, it's very easy for Moderna and Pfizer to bring vaccines to market under a year. That didn't happen in 2020. That started in the 1990s when they started researching those particular platforms. And similarly, that's what we've done with Cardano. We've leveraged computer science that came from the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. And we built upon the shoulders of giants. And then those papers gave us a really good trade-off profile that we think will allow us to be very competitive as we scale to millions of users.
I want to pick up on that point of governance and first principles, because I think that, what we've seen for the past decade with hard forks, this is where governance potentially could have prevented something like that. Instead, we have hard forks when two groups disagree and there's no consensus. And so then, one group carves off. We've seen that, happening even with Bitcoin. Ethereum, in fairness to them, they have, launched ETH2 to address exactly the issue that everybody's experiencing right now, which is it as a utilitarian cryptocurrency. Everybody's using it for DeFi, and it becomes enormously expensive. And so to understand from the point of view of first principles, when you have that governance, can you avoid things like hard forks? Can you avoid and or preserve value for the people who were with you from day one at ADA or ADA?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first off, when you think about governance and hard forks and these types of things, you're always going to have change in a system because technology changes, preferences change, governments change. It wasn't too long ago that the British Empire was around and the American Empire came. And I guess the 21st century, maybe it's going to be the Chinese Empire. So things change a lot. And when they change, they tend to change everything with them. And then we have a lot of new things that come, like quantum computers and AI and IoT revolution and edge computing. And so when you have all these things, you say, wow, my system has to work a little differently in order to be interoperable with it and also be able to keep up with other standards that are emerging out of that. So in cryptocurrencies, we have many different units of change. And the hard fork is the most dramatic because what it does is says, okay, we're going to retire the kind of the concepts of the old system, and we're going to replace it with a kind of new operating model. It can be very dramatic. You can change your monetary policy, you can change your network stack, you can change from proof of work to proof of stake, for example, what F2 is doing. We went from a BFT mode to a proof of stake system, like when we went from Byron to Shelley. These are very big and often traumatic events. So we recognize that with Cardano, we built a very special change management system called a hard fork combinator. What this basically does is it makes it very easy for us to do a hard fork without shattering the network. So since we instituted it back in July of last year, we've already done one hard fork. We did the Allegra hard fork in December. Nobody even noticed. It was a very graceful upgrade. And we have another one planned in February, and we're going to add all kinds of capabilities, multi-asset capabilities to our ledger. And again, that hard fork is going to be very easy to do. That's only one dimension of it. So that's the operation of change management. But then there's the consent and legitimacy of change management. So, it's like a voting system. When you have an election and you elect someone, the person only gets to be a president if they get enough votes to be the president. But then also people have to believe the system was fair. Otherwise, they're an illegitimate leader. Well, similarly, if you want to change the system analogously, you really need to have legitimacy and proper democracy, some form of a voting system amongst the relevant stakeholders to say, yeah, that's okay. The issue with Bitcoin is they don't really have that explicitly. So even novel things that are quite trivial, like expanding the block size or acting SegWit, can take years to be able to push into the system. And so it really slows it down. And then you have this bizarre thing that as you grow in user base, it becomes harder and harder and harder to change even simpler things. So for Cardano, what we did is we actually spent 4 years working with professors at Lancaster and some people in China, and led by Professor Bin Chang. And we wrote actually not only a treasury system, but actually a very novel voting system that uses all the word salad of cryptography, like homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs, and these things. The long and short is it allows anyone who holds ADA to be able to participate in a process to eventually vote on what to fund and what to change. And then once that's been voted on, we can use the hard fork combinator to be able to update the system. We also worked with the European Union to develop that system. So we received a grant from the Horizons 2020 program and worked with Guard Time and IBM Research. We spent years thinking about how do we make these changes in a very graceful way for decentralized software updates. So there's a lot of really novel, cool stuff that's under the hood of Cardano. Now, your other question about value preservation, I think the key behind value preservation is use and utility. So markets are fickle. Amazon, for example, at its peak in the dot-com boom, it took 11 years for Amazon to get back to that value between 2000 and 2011, but they were a fundamentally different company. So the value of Amazon in 2011 was based upon different fundamentals and foundations. Mm-hmm. They were an AI company. They were the everything store. They had Amazon Web Services. They've clearly built up a gargantuan user base. They had Amazon Prime. They basically were their own post office. They had massive warehouses. None of those things were present in 2000. So when you look at ADA, even just from 2017, when we first hit market to today, we're backed by hundreds of thousands of adherents, by more than a dozen companies that actively develop code for Cardano, a governance foundation, and also several commercialization entities, and a lot of projects and a lot of passionate excitement, as well as 1,200 state cooperators. So that's what preserves your value, is just keep growing your community, keep growing your utility. And the markets will go up and down. If Bitcoin goes to $500,000, even the junkiest of junk coins will probably be in the billions because of a rising tides effect. And you could be like saving children in Sudan, and you'd still be in the toilet if Bitcoin goes to $2,000 because there's a falling tides effect as well. And that's in the short term. Well, you say, okay, well, if we take a cross section 5 years in, 10 years in, 15 years in, 20 years in, who's still around and who has preserved their value and how's the system grown? You have to look for use and utility for that. And then, ADA will take its rightful role as a governance token, a finite resource for computation, and also a way of sorting out the security of the system and being able to quantify the security in a much better way than proof of work does. And from that perspective, I think our prospects are quite good.
From a utility point of view, how have you seen enterprise using ADA coin, the ADA cryptocurrency?
Yeah, so for Cardano enterprise adoption, we're just getting started with that. So we've had many conversations. Like we worked last year and in 2019 with New Balance, for example, and we did an authentication product and Kawhi Leonard's shoe line. I got to see sneakerheads in LA before the lockdown, and they were able to verify their sneakers on the blockchain. And we did a lot of pilots with governments in particular. We love GovTech because you can have huge scale, like millions of people, but oftentimes you have a more relaxed and intimate relationship, whereas the Fortune 500 procurement chain is a little longer and tougher. And what ends up usually happening is there you work with like the science division, but then what they do is they say, hey, we'll just build it in-house or something like that because they have the capabilities to do that. Whereas governments will give you a little bit more freedom. And what's nice is if the program works, you get a strong barrier to exit. That said, this is the year that we're going to start pursuing aggressively the Fortune 500. The advantage we have is we have Frederick Brigard over at the Cardano Foundation, and he used to work with PwC, and he really understands that world quite well. And we also are Chief Commercial Officer at IOHK. He came from Dell, and he understands that world quite well. And what you usually try to do on that side is to solve a problem with at least a 10x over what they're doing. In particular, what we're interested in is when there's globalization of Fortune 500 into the developing world. So they look, for example, at markets like Ethiopia, and they say, well, there's 107 million people there. 70% of those people are at or under the age of 30. They're getting online. They don't have strong consumer preferences yet. And there's a lot of illiquid wealth that's starting to become liquid. Prior to the pandemic, the economy was growing 10 to 15% each year. So it's kind of like China in the 1980s, where they were all poor then, but we all kind of knew that they would be rich later. So if you get in early, you can kind of build brand preferences with them, and you can get a rising tides effect in that economy. So Africa is definitely going to be one of the fastest growing continents throughout the next 20 to 30 years. And so we see a lot of Western companies that want to do business there. The problem is you have sovereign risk, you have lack of rule of law, there still is some endemic corruption, and it's very difficult to process payments and other such things. So a Fortune 500 company needs new tools to be able to get into that market and work with those consumers, whether they do it directly or they do it through a subsidiary with appropriate localized branding. And so what we do is what we can facilitate that because we've been in those jurisdictions, especially Ethiopia, for example, for over 3 years. So we know the politics, we know the regulations, we already have the government relationships, and we know a lot of local businesses. And so you can use blockchain as a great binder, especially when you are buying things in those jurisdictions. For example, if you're Starbucks and you look at coffee, when the CEO says, hey, we're only going to do fair trade and also environmentally sustainable farming practices, that's not just a mandate from above, that's a big economic change for an economy like Ethiopia, because the way that they grow coffee, it's kind of the way that your great grandfather grew coffee and his great grandfather grew coffee. They're not exactly thinking so much about carbon credits and which fertilizer to use, and do we have equal pay amongst the genders and the people participating here. I mean, they're just trying to feed their families. And the problem is if they can't satisfy that corporate mandate, they actually lose market access. They can no longer sell coffee to the largest coffee buyer in the world, and they'll lose that to Indonesia or to Colombia or to another marketplace. So it's not optional to upgrade. They actually have to upgrade. And so that's a situation where you can kind of take care of the Fortune 500 and give them more protections and get them a product that they understand more about. And at the same time, you can put a completely new system into that economy that not only covers the supply chain, but also can be a payment system, an identity system, a voter registration system, a census system, a system for microcredit and microinsurance where they can insure crops and then borrow, especially fertilizer vouchers and these things, or infrastructure vouchers for like mechanization of the farms and so forth. And that alone can bring billions of dollars or create billions of dollars of wealth, but then also will allow Starbucks to continue purchasing coffee in that particular jurisdiction. So these types of public-private partnerships and situations where there's global consumption of a good or service, I think that's probably the most effective way of bringing the Fortune 500 into the cryptocurrency space. What's probably, in my view, the least effective way of doing that is to try to replicate what we saw with the failures of Ethereum in the early days, where they would go to like an IBM and Samsung with Project Adept and say, hey, we're doing IoT. This is so exciting. And then after a year of working with them, IBM says, hey, thank you for all that knowledge. We're going to go create Fabric now and go and do that. So you see that a lot where you can have a knowledge transfer, you can spend a lot of time, but then when you actually get to the point where you want to build something, because these companies are so large and they have lots of engineers, what they tend to do is they tend to just build something in-house, if anything, because it better fits their politics and it better fits their product lines that they already have. Or what
But doesn't that erode your value then with Cardano and Shelley and Ada
No,
coin? I mean, if people are doing it in-house, why would they need you?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. That's why you have to blend it with added value from domain expertise or regional access or government partnerships, because it's actually more cost effective and lower risk to go with a local solution, especially when the local solution is mandated as you go into Ethiopia, Uganda. If you go into like New York or San Francisco or something like that, and you're trying to deploy this into European market or US market, there you tend to have a problem where either a bigger contractor will inevitably displace you because politically it's easier and more palatable, or the company will just simply do it in-house. So I'm a bit skeptical in the Western markets, but I'm actually incredibly optimistic in the developing markets. But that's just one dimension of creating value for your system. What I care much more about is economic identity for the 3 billion people who don't have it. And I think that's actually far more profitable for everyone involved. Why? Because just in Africa alone, there's $5.6 trillion of illiquid wealth that you can unlock. And if you do so, then that wealth will get globalized. And the first platform to do that will be worth more, in my view, than Bitcoin. Just one quick example. In Ethiopia, the Agricultural Transformation Agency, which is responsible for 15 million smallholder farmers, every year gives fertilizer vouchers to those farmers. Now, these are sovereign backed, and they have a 90% plus repayment rate, and the interest rates can be 10 to 15%. So there's just not many financial products in the Western world that have a sovereign guarantee behind them or an NGO guarantee that they're 90% repayment and a 15% interest rate. In the age of negative interest rates, you don't see financial products like that. The problem with these
Exactly.
products is they're very illiquid and they're
Mm.
small in the individual sense. But if you were to make them liquid and aggregate them like an MBS or CDO, then you suddenly could have hundreds of millions of dollars of these vouchers and sell them as financial products in the Western world.
Yeah.
So it's an example of a win-win because that would actually bring direct foreign investment. So you get more vouchers and more capital. So more farmers are getting upgraded, but you still have the same basic premise there that there's real substance behind it. So these are
So
new
what I'm,
products that you can create, bring to market. And that's the
yeah.
kind of stuff that gets me excited because, from the farmer's perspective, they have access to more capital, higher quality capital, and they can go from just fertilizer to mechanization. And then from the Western world's perspective, they get new products that they previously could never imagine selling that are significantly better in quality and returns than the products that they see right now in the Western world.
I'm hearing, an answer to the question that I actually wanted to ask you, which is, Shelley came last year. The market has advanced so much, Ethereum being one of them in the enterprise space. You talk about Fortune 500, they're much more familiar and might already participate, with different protocols. And so, how do you bridge this market gap of, or delay getting into the market when you have adoption that is increasing every day from the Fortune 500s? But what I think I heard and is that you're focusing on Africa, on EMEA, and that's going to be the differentiator.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. It's like people say in 2006, God, how are we going to compete with Palm and BlackBerry and Nokia? These guys are so incredibly entrenched. Or like in 2001, how are you going to compete with Microsoft Windows? I mean, this is a monopoly, 98% market share. You win by changing the game, and you win by doing new things that haven't been done before, and people get wowed by those things. And so if it's a game of, well, how do we poach market share from IBM and Microsoft and Amazon and Google, or from incumbents like Ethereum, you're really not going to win there because there's unfair regulatory and network advantages. Even Ethereum, it's daunting if they were to compete against Microsoft, because let's say Microsoft wakes up tomorrow and says, yeah, we're going to do Windows coin and put it into every operating system. Well, you have 3 billion customers that, and you have that right there. I mean, we saw that network effect with Netscape versus Internet Explorer, where you basically had an inferior product dominate and crush a superior product simply just because of that platform monopoly. And the same for Samsung, and the same for Apple, and the same for Google. And as soon as the regulations recede enough, the FANGs will get involved in the cryptocurrency space. We already saw Facebook flirting with it, and they're just trying to figure out a path that the regulators are okay with.
And they've got 2.5 billion right there.
Exactly. And so it's like, why play that game? You're going to lose that game, just like Apple would have been crushed if they were trying to commoditize the iPhone and fight Nokia, because that company already had such distribution. Instead, what they did is they created an experience and something new that never really been done before. And as a consequence, they redefined the market around that new thing. So when we looked at DeFi, for example, DeFi is a toy. We have all these great apps that are out there, and they're certainly growing in market cap. But does anybody really need peer-to-peer lending or peer-to-peer insurance if they live in New York or if they live in DC? Not really. Right. Does anybody really need a payment service if they already have PayPal and all these other things? Not really. Oh, we'll have such lower fees. Like, no, first, that's not true with Ethereum. But then second, even if it was, it's like there's already brand loyalty, regulation, consumer preferences, and network effect. Good luck beating that. But then when you go for a place like Uganda or Tanzania, they have
emerging markets, developing markets.
Exactly. And this is a situation where 70% of the population is at or under the age of 30, and they're all going to be online within the next 5 or 10 years. And they don't really like their local currencies, their local banking infrastructure. In many cases, they're trying to evade capital controls. So, and they're used to digital currencies. They have M-Pesa and these other things. So that market's primed, it's ready. And there's 1 billion plus consumers in it, and there's $5.6 trillion of liquid wealth. So when I talk about DeFi, that's the market. And so when people say, well, where should I deploy my DeFi application? Should I deploy it where it's just going to be yield farmers and kids living in their mom's basements, trading, who are 25 years old and don't need this? Or do you want to deploy it to the platform that has 30 million, 40 million customers on it who are primed and ready to go to create real demand and growth for your application? So that's how you really do achieve a network effect. And you say, well, how do you attract the Fortune 500? You do it by saying, hey, would you like access to the 100 million customers on my platform who now have money and would like to consume your products? Oh, of course. And so that's a much easier conversation than going and trying to do a time and materials contract and say, please, sir, on board to my blockchain system. And oh, and by the way, buy my token too. It doesn't work that way in the Fortune
Yeah.
500 world. It's a
How
crazy
does
competition.
how does interoperability fit into this strategy as well?
So interoperability, there's different ways of looking at it, but succinctly, the idea would be that usually you're either moving information, users, or value between systems. So users are just that I would like to switch from one experience to another experience and somehow have a seamlessness about that. So for example, if you're on your cell phone and then you want to go to your desktop computer, that Microsoft Continuum, they looked at that of how do you go from your phone to your Windows device and back and be able to move files between them and experiences between them. Like if you're working on a Word document on your phone, you could just somehow start working on that document on your computer. So that's an example of interoperability where you have a user go from one system to another system. Information are like oracles, these things. So there's all these things that happen outside of your network, like who won the Super Bowl or who won the election and these things, or the price of Bitcoin relative to the US dollar, for example. And you need to inject that information into the system. Okay, so you have to move it around all these different blockchains. You have to move state and foreign information. And then finally, you have value. Okay, this is what we usually think of when we talk about side chains or these other things. And that's just basically say, I have a token living in one system and I want to move it to another system. Okay, so now we have wrapped Bitcoin, or maybe I have a voting token. I'm going to use this and it gives me voting rights in a particular network. So the problem we have in our industry right now is we really haven't had our Wi-Fi moment. The miracle of Wi-Fi is it works everywhere. So you can be in North Korea and the Wi-Fi will actually work the same way as it does in the United States or in Iran and Israel. Those four countries will never collectively agree on anything, yet your Wi-Fi standard will be the same in all four countries. Okay. So that tells you that they're interoperable, but we don't have that in the cryptocurrency space right now. There's many different systems, BFT-based systems, proof-of-work-based systems, proof-of-stake-based systems, and so forth. And each and every one of them, they carry different nuances about how to prove two things. First, when you move a token, that token exists. So it's a real token. And second, that token has not been double spent. So how do you avoid, for example, when you move your Bitcoin to Litecoin, also moving that Bitcoin to Dash or another system like Ethereum at the same time? So you've actually duplicated it. It's a legitimate token, but you've doubled it. So you need a proof of non-existence of a double spend and a proof of existence of that token. Now, the naive way of solving this is for everybody on the receiving chain to have a copy of the other blockchain, but that doesn't scale so well. No one can preserve the state of all these different systems. So ideally, you'd like succinct proofs to do that. So they basically only a few kilobytes of data that usually goes with the asset. And then that alone is sufficient for you to trustlessly verify that the token is valid or not. So there's a whole field of cryptography that's emerging in our industry to build succinct proofs. There are things like Halo for recursive snarks. We have things like NIPAPOWs that we've invented in-house with Dionysius Sindros and Aggelos Gassis. And there's dozens of other protocols. Some require trust in third parties, some do not. It just depends on facts and circumstances. Some work only with proof of work systems. Some could potentially work with all systems. Some work with only proof of stake systems. So it's a very nuanced field, and we haven't really gotten to a standard yet for all systems. And that's something that will come over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, and I think that's really the exciting part of it, because it really could be the next stage of growth for the entire industry. And I note that Cardano is working on interoperability with Litecoin. Litecoin, as we know, is a fork from the Bitcoin blockchain. So in terms of its interoperability with Cardano and Shelley and all of these, new ways of using it, what do you think it means for other projects that follow similar code basics as Bitcoin's blockchain gene?
Well, that's the beauty of working with something like Litecoin, because it's a descendant of Bitcoin. If it works with Litecoin, it's probably going to work with Bitcoin or Dash or any of these other guys. And that's great. And so NEPA POWs is the particular primitive that we're looking there. We'll write a Litecoin improvement proposal. And what's really cool about it is that they gain a lot and they don't give up anything. So normally in the world, you have trade-offs. For example, you take the medicine, it may, like chemotherapy, it'll cure your cancer, but your hair falls out and you feel like crap and maybe it takes a few years off your life. And so usually you have to accept from some form of trade-off. But NEPA POWs are cool because they give you an additional data structure, but they don't diminish the security of the system at all. And they also give you great light client support at the same time. So it's one of those rare gifts where science has figured out a clever hack that you get a lot for free. And it's so uncommon when those things come, and when they come, you treasure them like you treasure family members or something. So it's going to be really cool to see NEPA POWs if we can get it adopted in Litecoin. Basically use that as the proving ground, and then we anticipate that we'll see rapid adoption amongst other systems like Bitcoin Cash and other reasonably capped proof of work cryptocurrencies. The problem is that getting it into Bitcoin is going to be quite difficult. There's some backdoor ways of doing that with like lighter than hard forks. They're called velvet forks, where you just get some miners to kind of inject these proofs into the system. You don't really have to change your consensus rules or fork anything. And just by having a few miners do that, you can use that structure to still do sidechain. So it's a very easy way of getting support. And some are doing it. But they actually get it at the protocol level and install it and make it part of the system and mandatory for miners to do. I don't think we'll see that in Bitcoin for 5 or 10 years, even though it's a great idea and it's wonderful. No matter what great ideas you have, the system is simply too big, and it's an anarchistic governance system. So it's almost impossible to get enough consensus for that system to converge and evolve to the next level. So I'm very optimistic that we'll see coins like Litecoin at some point adopt these types of things. If not this year, then in the coming years. I'm less than optimistic that we'll see that in Bitcoin. And that's okay. There are other ways that we can kind of sneak it in that will probably be good enough. And you can also introduce trusted third parties if necessary to ensure that interoperability. And it's important to point out that that primitive only works with proof of work systems. And so if you look at a system like Polkadot, if you look at a system like EOS, a system like Tezos or Cardano, you actually need fundamentally different cryptography for these types of things. And then there's even other systems that use things like recursive snarks, which are much, much more complex, and they use much, much heavier mathematics. And that's still an emerging field. There's projects like Halo, for example, and the most recently out of Stanford from Dan Bonnet, Halo Infinite. They have a lot of promise and they do a lot more. For example, you'll always have full node security with light clients if recursive snarks work. But again, it requires different assumptions, a little bit more trust in mathematics, and a lot heavier implementations. And they're a lot slower to build and verify these proofs than they would a normal transaction. So given that, I think we're still a few years out for that type of technology to become relevant. But I'm very optimistic that will actually become dominant technology within this decade.
One of the things that is emerging technology as well is quantum computing and quantum technology. Do you think that could actually be disruptive to all the work that we're seeing in blockchain?
Yeah, I think quantum computing will be an issue in the 2030s. I don't think it's going to be quite an issue in the 2020s. And so there's this natural question, why are governments so paranoid about it? And the issue governments have is that adversaries archive data. So the United States monitors all of China's traffic, and Russia monitors all the United States' traffic, and they both monitor all of Russia's traffic and vice versa. And they archive it. Even though it's encrypted and they can't do anything with it, they're waiting for a breakthrough in mathematics or in computation, and then eventually they can decrypt those communications. So when quantum computers come, all that archived PGP emails and all that archived SSL stuff, they'll be able to break that. And then suddenly they can read all the classified information that's been transmitted of each other. So what you want to do is you would like to upgrade your cryptography and start using post-quantum crypto, so cryptography that's immune to quantum computers, as soon as possible, because it mitigates the risk of that archived classified information. So, something in 2020 could be harmful in 2035, but, something in like 1960 is, probably not so harmful to be revealed in, in 2035. Like, for example, what Kennedy's suit size was, or the chairman of the suit was in 1961 is probably, it's an interesting historical footnote, but it's not a national security risk. But
Yeah.
military systems, they tend to be in circulation for decades. We're still using the Warthog, we're still using the M1 Abrams
Yep.
and these things.
It's a great
So if
point.
those schematics from 2000 are leaked in 2035, it would give you a lot of information how to defeat that weapon system, for example. And spies, they might work for 30 years for your agency. So if they were transmitting things 15 years ago, and you'd be able to use that to dox assets that you have in the economy. So NIST is working diligently to try to upgrade all of America's cryptography through the same processes they use to create AES and these other things. And most of this decade will be spent getting the right post-quantum crypto. You have all kinds of things like super singular isogenies with elliptic curve crypto. You have hash-based crypto. You have lattice-based crypto, which is my favorite because the math is so beautiful. But each and every one of them, they carry trade-off profiles. One of the reasons why the cryptocurrency space has not adopted these primitives yet is cost and performance. When you look at the signature sizes, when you look at the validation times for post-quantum signatures, they tend to be 10 to 100 times larger and up to 1,000 times slower than elliptic curve crypto. So that trade-off is just not what we need it to be yet. And then the problem is a lot of these cool things like zero knowledge proofs, they make assumptions that don't work so well with quantum computers. Some do not, like, for example, Starkware Starks are quantum resistant, but most of the snarks on market, like Sonics and these other things, like Zcash's primitives or Monero's bulletproofs, they don't work with quantum computers. The other thing is you have to model all of your things with something called a quantum adversary to prove that quantum computers can
Yeah.
break them. It's going to take 5 or 10 years of academic research to
But to your
close that
point,
loop and kill those trade-offs. And the good
yeah.
news is that we will have less of an issue than the governments have, because once we upgrade to post-quantum systems, what we'll do is likely just take a hash of the blockchain, and then even if you can reverse transactions, for example, from the legacy part of the chain, it won't match the checkpoint that was created for between the classical system and the post-quantum system. So in practice, it's not going to, I don't think quantum computers are going to cause much harm to our industry. They're going to cause
Yeah, that's
huge harm
interesting.
to internet communication. They're going to cause huge harm to nation states that are trying to preserve secrets. And certainly a lot of archived encrypted data can be reversed. Also, Satoshi's private keys can be broken, so people can start signing with Satoshi's, PGP key if they wanted to. So that kind of stuff will happen. But actual reversal of transactions and stealing of user funds and these things, in practice, a competent blockchain architect can prevent that from happening.
Okay, that's actually really great insight. But in terms of being an oracle, as you are, just to understand that you've got to start now, and governments, but also corporates. So how to really protect corporate knowledge and databases. I want to ask you about WhatsApp. Privacy is such a huge, issue, and especially for users. And Facebook just announced that it will migrate all the data, including our contacts, our list, to be used in an enterprise way for Facebook. That's really causing a ripple of concern, really, amongst users around the world. What is the thinking from your perspective on privacy, on blockchain, on how individuals can protect essentially, our own conversations and our own private thoughts?
Well, there's the old adage, if the product is free, you are the product. So, you get WhatsApp for free, you get Facebook for free, Google for free. It's not free. Basically, you're going to be data mined, and data is the new oil. And there's a great book from Susanna. It was Surveillance Capitalism. The book really goes into detail about how that economy has emerged and the consequences of it. And there's not much you can do with these large services to shield yourself, because data collection occurs at almost every level of the infrastructure. Windows 10 spies on you, your cell phone spies on you, Facebook spies on you, your search engine spies on you. you're leaking all the time, all kinds of data, from your preferences to your location, to consumer information, some cases very private information, like your age, sexual preference, these types of things. So this is certainly the challenge of our time. Now, some of these challenges are going to be resolved through global standards. Some of these will be resolved through laws, like, for example, the right to be forgotten and GDPR, and these types of things. These are preliminary attempts to try to rein in these things a bit. And so there's a lot of questions usually come about, how do consumers protect themselves? And you can buy computers like a System 76 laptop, and that's got an open source firmware, and it uses a nice spyware-free form of Linux. There's certainly things you can do there. The problem is that that's not a good user experience for most people. And then there's certain radicals like Richard Stallman, for example, who only uses free software and encrypts everything. And you can do that, but again, the vast majority of consumers just simply don't have the skills or are unwilling to make the usability trade-offs, myself included. I'm the CEO of a company that literally creates cryptographic protocols. I still have an Android phone, a Samsung phone. I use a Note, and I'm fully aware that my Google account spy on me. I'm fully aware that my Facebook page spies on me and so forth, and I accept that and I understand that. So what I do is I have segregated communication. So for very sensitive things, I have environments that I can go into, and those environments leak significantly less information than my standard usability environment. I segregate that. There are apps like Signal, for example. Elon Musk was recently, pushing that, but I think that's kind of a false hope, because you're encrypting on the wire, so the transmission of the information is not problematic. But remember, whenever you send a message to people, it's not just about your security standards, it's also about the recipient's security standards. So, for example, if I sent my mother, who's really bad with computers, anything at all, she's probably protecting that information with a 6-digit password. Whereas I have a 120-digit password generated with a password generator and two-factor authentication. She's got a rickety door behind that, and it's the same message on both sides.
Yeah.
So even though it's encrypted from transit, she has a decrypted version of that. So really, it's like what Benjamin Franklin said: the best way of keeping a secret amongst two people is for one of them to be dead. The reality is that it's very difficult in practice in information security to preserve your privacy of information unless all members involved are well educated and have great platforms to preserve that. Now, overall, the IT sector is getting better. Samsung has Knox now. We have more proliferation of encrypted emails, like PGP encrypted emails. We have the Signal protocol, which is both a product and an open protocol. We're starting to see a lot more usage of end-to-end encryption. We're seeing a lot more usage of one-time, perfect word secrecy, these types of things. And that's great. And that's good to see that leak in, mostly because nation states are requesting it. Like when America sends something, they'd like to know that it's protected against eavesdroppers abroad. But the reality is that this is the challenge of the 21st century. And there's just no way that we as consumers can solve it completely. And even if we think we have, there are also hardware backdoors. It's very important to understand that. There's very good evidence that Intel chips, Apple chips, ARM chips probably have some form of a hardware backdoor in them that nation states can use, or the companies themselves can use, to breach encrypted enclaves and to dox your systems. That's been around for at least a decade, if not longer. So the problem with the hardware backdoor is it's like a skeleton key. No matter how good your digital hygiene is, how good your software is, you can have a kludgy System 76 laptop and all these great things. But then if the Intel chip that's inside of that has a problem with it, I've lost all security if Intel decides that I've lost all security. And the problem is, unless you're going to the beach and scooping the sand with your own cup and making your own semiconductors, there's no real good way to, I stole that one from This Week in Security with Steve Gibson. He often says that you have to, you use your own sand to make your own semiconductors. You're not really going to guarantee that privacy.
Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, who's the adversary? Are you protecting yourself against cyber criminal, organized crime? And if you're Snowden and trying to avoid nation states, you're going to have a dreary, very paranoid life. Just as one example, There's a brilliant academic in Israel named Mordecai Gurian, and his whole expertise is in private data exfiltration. So basically, what he does is he takes things that are supposed to be like super secure and he finds a way to break them. Air gap systems is his expertise. So an air gap system is a system that's not connected to the internet. So you'd like to believe
Hmm.
if there's no internet connection, a remote hacker
You're
can't break
safe,
into it,
right?
right? Because there's no physical connection to
Yeah.
get in. Well, he has invented some of the coolest techniques. Like one way is if he can get a Trojan into your computer, he could turn your RAM into a Wi-Fi transmitter. They call it AirFi or RAMFi, I think. And then it actually can basically broadcast at a
Wow.
low bit rate everything that's in memory. They developed a microphone that you could take to a coffee shop and it can listen to your laptop operate. And just by the changes of frequency of the processor, it can actually steal a PGP key, an encryption key, just by listening to your processor with a microphone. The guy does amazing work, and that's public work. The intelligence agencies are like decades ahead of that. They have so many great capabilities. They can listen to you through light bulbs. It's crazy what capabilities they have. So, you have these normal consumers who are like, I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to be a secret squirrel and do all these things. It's like, you guys don't know what you're up
Good
against.
luck.
This is a much more complicated thing. So you need to protect yourself against reasonable adversaries like cyber criminals and these things. And, creating a good security. I even created a lecture, an hour and a half long lecture to kind of explain that hygiene can prevent you from being hacked by most people. You also have to incubate yourself from social engineering. It's tremendously difficult. Most hackers, like the recent Twitter hack that got into Bill Gates's account and
Yeah.
Musk's account, all these other, that was actually not a brilliant hack where they like figured out how to break encryption or something. They just impersonated employees and used that impersonation to basically convince people to give them access to systems. So the systems were secure. It was the human that was the
Yeah,
weak
it's the
link.
phishing. Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And
Exactly.
90% of the time, that's what happens is that social engineering component comes in. So you have to inoculate yourself from social engineering. And then, you also have to use the right software and hardware. So it's very difficult in practice to actually solve these problems.
Living in the 21st century is, I think, I mean, you've just schooled us all on, once upon a time when, we warned the teens, whatever you put on Facebook, it's never going to go away. And essentially, what you're telling us right now is whatever we are thinking that we're doing in the privacy of our own home and in private texts, I mean, at some point it's all probably going to be out there. So I'm gonna welcome you to this part of the interview, which is Forkast Forecasts. Your top three predictions for 2021. What do you see is going to be the most important developments in the blockchain industry, in technology that we can anticipate coming down the pipeline for 2021? And I'd also love to hear, from Cardano's point of view, what developments we can see from you guys.
Well, I think the single most important thing, I'm a little biased because I live in the United States. I'm based in Colorado. And so obviously, I think a lot about US policy and where the United States is going. But I think the single biggest development for our industry is going to be what Janet Yellen does. And so now that the Democrats have taken the Senate, she will be the next Treasury Secretary. And basically, she's going to have to make the decisions of what is FinCEN going to do? What is the SEC going to do? What is the CFTC going to do? And we've kind of gotten to the put up or shut up phase of cryptocurrencies. So for a long time, it was, well, we'll let it mature and evolve and we'll give them a jubilee and a grace period. And we'll go after like people who kind of rock the boat too much or obvious fraud, but we're not going to get too hands on. And recently, Secretary Mnuchin, he kind of dropped a whole bunch of regulations on the way out. For example, the Treasury Department's interpretation of the FATF regulations, the travel rule compliance. So now we don't have this idea of anonymous wallets anymore. So these kinds of things are coming, and Yellen is going to be the secretary that during her tenure is going to make those decisions either directly or indirectly. Much of that policy may be set in 2021 or 2022. And this can be everything from stablecoin regulation to custodial standards to how they're going to regulate DeFi or not regulate DeFi, what level of KYC is required for everything, what level of privacy you have to have, what level of transparency you have to have, what consumer protections are going to be applied. when and how the SEC is allowed to get involved. The Ripple test is likely going to come out because of this litigation with Ripple. It's either going to expand Howey or contract Howey based upon how that litigation goes. And so that is probably going to be a big deal, because whatever that gets set, the European Union will likely follow somewhat similar regulations. And then the whole world will either be equivalent or contrasting, but it's going to set the global regulatory standard. And then China is obviously setting their own standards. So there'll be this US standard and these Chinese standards. And they're going to try to sort all that out. So no matter what I do, I think Yellen is probably going to have far more impact than Vitalik or myself or any other people in the industry. If it's done in the right way, I think she's the person who decides whether we have $100,000 Bitcoin or $1,000 Bitcoin. Because if she, for example, says, yeah, institutional investors, everything's fine, and here's an obvious path to diversify assets, the money managers simply have too much money. If you're the sovereign wealth fund of Norway, you have $1.5 trillion. If you're BlackRock, you have more. How the hell do you get 6% returns, 9% returns when they tell you can no longer invest in petrochemicals or this and that and SP sustainable? You got to do it somewhere. So there are a lot of them are saying, well, yeah, we'll throw a percentage point into crypto. What's 1% of $1.5 trillion? That's not.
It's a lot.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Collectively, that could mean hundreds of billions of dollars of value flowing into our industry. The other thing is there's demographic changes that are creating floodgates for our industry as well. They're lowering floodgates. In particular, if you poll anyone under the age of 30 in the United States, they're statistically more likely to hold a cryptocurrency than a stock or bond or gold. So the young are buying our stuff in our industry, and they're not buying the old stuff. So there's a movement of wealth there. So the US government's going to have to make some decisions of whether to speed that up, slow that down, keep it at the same pace. So that's the first major thing I think is going to occur in our industry. Second, there's a lot of technology that's forcing a conversation, and the great movement of value from proof of work to proof of stake is occurring. Currently, the leader there is Ethereum, with Ethereum 2. And obviously, we're hellions on their heels, nipping at them. I'm trying to be the Facebook to their MySpace, and we'll see what happens there. But all of us collectively, whether you're Polkadot or EOS or Tezos or Cardano, we're trying to say that proof of stake is much better than proof of work, at least the Bitcoin flavor of proof of work. And F2 is the 800-pound gorilla that's really pushing that. So what's happening is a lot of funds are saying, hey, there's going to be a reallocation of the distribution of wealth, we call it Bitcoin dominance, from proof of work to something else, and they're starting to bet on portfolios. So that trend is going to get really interesting, and it's going to open up a lot of regulatory questions and tax questions about the operation of proof of stake that are distinctly different from proof of work. And this is definitely the year where we're going to see that occur in mass, and this is the year that we're going to see that heating up quite a bit. And then finally, this is the year where people are going to, in my view, start really talking about some of the uncomfortable truths of blockchain systems. The cult of Satoshi, I started with Bitcoin. I love Bitcoin. I think it's an amazing thing, but it's a replicated system. And what that effectively means is for it to work, everybody has to know each other's stuff. Everybody, when you're running a full node, has the same data. That works when you have a gigabyte blockchain. That doesn't work when you have a petabyte blockchain, an exabyte blockchain. So if we're really talking about use and adoption, you can't have a system where everybody's equal and everybody stores the same data and everybody has access to a supercomputer.
It's physically impossible.
It's physically impossible. So you'll have to go from a homogeneous system where everybody's the same to a heterogeneous system. You also have to start discussing some uncomfortable truths, like maybe we don't store everything forever, especially with smart contracts. Let's say you're doing a gambling smart contract. Is the fact that I got 2 pair on the third hand of poker in a game I played 7 years ago something that we should preserve for the rest of the time? Probably not. But then you're violating Satoshi's principles. You're now saying we go from immutable and everything's preserved forever to we're going to prune things and throw things away. So data is going to become an economic agent at some point, and you're going to have to pay rent for it. And if you don't, at some point it's going to have to go away. But how to organize that and how to sort that out is going to be quite difficult. So the movement from replicated to distributed, where we all have different views of the system and we don't all store the same things and consume the same resources, whether it be computation or data or network resources. There's been a lot of discussion for a long time with things like IPFS and these things about how to do that. But we haven't quite gotten there, and we're getting to a point where adoption is now forcing that conversation. Ethereum alone is in the many terabytes. It's getting just too expensive to do things, and they're already sharding. And when you start sharding, you now have availability problems because not everybody has the same view. Okay, so that conversation is really starting to get active, and we're certainly a participant in it. There's certain things you can do to kind of offset it. For example, proof of stake usually introduces hierarchy by having stake pools and these other things. So you have these supercomputers that are always on and they can form the backbone of your system. And then everybody else may be a light client, but these architectures are being rapidly explored. And this is the year where I think those inconvenient truths are going to translate into progress and then eventually adoption. And once that gets settled, these systems are going to be significantly more competitive than Bitcoin or other such things. And finally, there has to be some sorting and blending of identity with all of this. So for a long time, we always acknowledge, yeah, we need identity. And we even created standards in our industry. Like through the W3C, we created the DID standard, the decentralized identifier. It was great work from Chris Allen and all these other guys. And Microsoft uses it. We're a member of the DIF, the Digital Identity Foundation, with Microsoft and all these other companies. I think there's 35 of them now. We have an identity product called Prism. That product is being used in production in the country of Georgia for academic credentials. And we're negotiating multi-million user deals with it throughout Africa. So that's an identity unit, and it's blockchain agnostic. So we talk about interoperability. When you talk about movement of users, you're actually talking about the movement of identity between these types of systems. Okay, so how do you do that? How do you sort that out? How do these things get not only created but authenticated? And then also, how do you revoke and transfer them? And how do you extend them and so forth? Super difficult question. And then what happens when you start talking about non-human identity? Intelligent agents like dApps and DAOs and these things, smart contracts that live on the chain. You want to identify an escrow contract. You want to identify a DAO. You want to identify an application like a DEX, for example. It needs a unique identifier because that thing is going to start talking to other machines on the chain. So for a long time, we've been conceptualizing it. Mike Hearn was talking about it, Turing Festival, I think, in 2012. So it's been a long time coming, but this is the year where it's getting big because the regulators are starting to demand it. They're starting to say, hey, you can no longer withdraw your Binance account to just any old wallet, be a KYC'd wallet. Okay, well, what does that actually mean under the hood? How do we actually KYC that? How do you actually know I own it? How do I prove I have custody of it, and so forth? So that's the other corollary, is the breaking of Satoshi's principle, that this concept of fungibility. We're going from fungible things to non-fungible things, in that not all tokens are created equally. In fact, we're even seeing that in Bitcoin with newly mined coins versus older coins. There's actually a premium on newly mined coins because they have no transaction history behind them. So they've never touched Iran, they've never touched North Korea, they've never touched sanctioned countries and so forth. So certain firms are willing to pay a little bit more money for newly
mined that's
Bitcoin
a great
because they have
point.
a lower clients, because there's no de minimis clause in money laundering or terrorist financing, right? So they're the same asset, but the history is relevant. So you actually breach fungibility. And so more of that is going to come in much more pervasive ways.
Yeah, and you're clear of liability, and the long reach of Uncle Sam. But wow, thank you for a brilliant, expansive, and broad conversation about that. I think you've really enlightened a lot of people about the things that we didn't think about, that as we go from theory, Satoshi, to practicality, and where technology is taking all of us. Charles Hoskinson, always a pleasure to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me on.
And thank you, everyone, for watching this latest episode of Word on the Block. I'm Angie Lau, Forkast.News Editor-in-Chief. Until the next time.
If you like that, come back for more. All you have to do is click like, always comment, we love that, and subscribe. And don't forget to watch the next one.